Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good.
Okey doke. Very good. Good. All right, what do we got here? Small group tonight, huh? Oh, there we go.
How many people are like supposed to be in this class?
Lots. Yeah, lots of folks. There are in your class, I think, 45 students. 45 or 48. Yeah, nobody ever wants to come to the Zoom meetings. So I don't know.
Are they mandatory?
No, they're not mandatory.
Um,
Well, I mean, they are in a sense that you either got to come to the live session or you've got to watch the recording.
yeah, true.
One or the other to get credit for attendance. But of the folks that are not showing up to the live, I have strong evidence that supports the notion that they are not watching the recorded sessions either. You know what? What can I do, right? I offer you guys my time and my experience, my information, and I give you the options for Q&A. Because you're on track to try and enter an industry that is extremely, extremely competitive, very unforgiving in terms of the tolerance for inexperience, the tolerance for error, the tolerance for anything other than absolute dedication. And so it's pretty easy to see from my point of view, given 30 years of experience in the industry itself, at a very high level. I get a very strong sense of the types of people that will succeed in this effort and those who will fail. And one of the earliest indicators, one of the clearest ways to see is your level of engagement. If you come to these sessions and you ask questions and you are engaged with the material, if you offer your point of view, which is very important to me, believe it or not, your questions, your points of view, your observations, those are really good, strong indicators that you will embrace the industry and you will probably do well.
Good to
Um,
know.
I used to try very hard to make people more engaged, and I realized that all it does is waste my time. It can be upsetting, and disappointing, and at the end of the day, all we can hope for is that you will at some point see the fruitlessness of this kind of behavior and avoid it, because I I used to give a lecture to my students called "The Industry Doesn't Want You," and that was first lecture my first lecture in any cinematography class at the beginning of each semester.
Good wake up call.
Well, and I offer it in earnest, and it's not
Oh
a
yeah.
smart ass, it's not a scared straight kind of snarky lecture. It's a pretty matter of fact, pretty honest expose of what you can expect when if you pursue the industry at the highest level. I mean, if you're gonna dink and dunk around doing, 48-hour film festivals until you're 60 years old, and you're and doing YouTube videos and stuff like that, and then keeping a day job. If that's your idea of having a film career, maybe that's okay. uh, I always felt like a film career was working on the movies that I was and my friends were going to buy tickets to go see in the theater. To me, that was a movie career. And if I was working on that content, and if I was meeting those people and working with those directors and those movie stars in those places, I felt like that was the movie business. I felt like that's where I needed to be. And so I gave the appropriate amount of effort
My
to that
mom was
goal.
my mom was watching one of your movies yesterday, Angels and Demons.
Oh God.
You
Yeah.
worked on that, didn't you? I know. I
That's
saw your IMDb.
that's the one that put me in the in the hospital bed for a year and a half. Yeah. Yeah. Well, what's the consensus? Was it any good?
Yeah, she actually really liked. I seen the Da Vinci Code. I haven't seen Angels and Demons,
Okay.
but
All right.
I like the Da Vinci Code. It was a good movie, but yeah, she saw it. She actually really liked it.
Oh,
There
good.
you go.
Well, it's nice to know when, your efforts are appreciated. Obviously, I was one of very many people that worked on that film, but
Still worked
you
on it.
claim a certain amount of ownership when you're working on something like that 14, 15 hours a day for I was on that movie from late August that year until almost Thanksgiving.
So like
Um,
a
and it
year and
was,
some
yeah,
months.
it was a monstrous volume of work. And there wasn't really, believe it or not, in the world that I was moving in, the lighting world, and we were at Sony most of that time. There was not that many of us. There was about a dozen guys. We had sets and gear strewn across about 15 stages at Sony. And so that's less than one guy per set per stage. So if that tells you anything about how much we were accomplishing.
It's
um
on Netflix, so you getting any of that revenue? That
oh God,
revenue?
no. No, the revenue goes to the above the line complement of the film
Yeah,
crew
I,
and
I
staff.
I took film production last year. I understand.
If you're in the IATSE, you
Above the line.
generally yeah, you're coming from the labor side of the talent pool. And labor does not enjoy the fringes like profit sharing or any revenues like the actors get. They get their checks every few months or every quarter or so, where they get their royalty payments and stuff. Unfortunately, we don't get those things. I wish that we did, because our investment in the projects and the amount of effort that we put forward is, I think, on an equal par. The only difference is the brand from the studio, and the title is not associated with the labor staff. It's more associated with the faces and performances. So that's where the lion's share of the profit sharing goes. So obviously the plan is to, at some point, get above the line and get those royalty checks, I suppose.
Yeah.
Um, I prefer to simply learn and do good work and feel comfortable with the resume that I have, so that I don't get a sense that 30 years was wasted doing something that where my time could have been better spent. I appreciate it when you guys say you saw something that I worked on and that you liked it and it was good. Because if you tell me that my work after so long was good, then that validates everything that I pursued in my time. So, and hopefully, you will create a body of work that one day, if you can imagine yourself in my seat, and one day a student comes to you and says they saw something that you did and that it was good. It's a highlight. It's a good moment. So I appreciate that compliment very much. Thank your mother for me.
Will
Um,
do.
and Tell her I said cheers.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we've attracted everybody we're going to get here for this session. How's everybody doing? All the familiar regulars I see. This is good. We might as well move on. And this should be a pretty short conversation. How you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing fine. I just had a little bit of an issue with my computer, so I had to start with my phone and then just reroute it to my computer because it was
Oh, okay.
lagging out.
Well, I'll tell you what. So I was having a conversation with a writer friend of mine out in LA the other night, and we were talking about he's a writer producer, and he was talking about a book deal that he's been pursuing for a while now, trying to get the rights to turn it into a production, and talking about the decided lack of intellectual property out there that's available these days, and how and we were talking about the industry and stuff, and I was grousing about the quality of the film scripts and the fact that there's very little um, beyond superhero movies for us to sink our teeth into these days. And then we got into that talk about that, and then I bragged on you a little bit there, Andrew. I said I got a student in my class that's seen every one of those movies and can tell you everything there is about it, and this is so this is important, and this is the gap that we're bridging here. And I talked about how I had given in one of my writing classes a rather lukewarm reception of a lecture about a movie called My Dinner with Andre, who another one of my students knew exactly what I was talking about. And I said, there is hope, but we have to bridge the gap somewhere between My Dinner with Andre and the Avengers universe, and create some film in somewhere in between that's going to resuscitate the industry. Otherwise, the film business is in big trouble. So we had a really funny conversation, and I bragged on you guys. I really did. So I appreciate that you guys come back every week and listen to my ramblings for an hour and a half or so, whatever it is.
Gotta have a French New Wave cinematic universe, I guess.
God, I wish. I mean, where the heck are the French right now when we need them? We need a resurgent.
We need more people like Jean-Luc Godard.
we do we need another somebody like that who re-injects a little bit of the purposeful
Or more Cecil B. DeMille's
cinematic awareness. Cinema, I think, is a literacy all of its own, right? It's you can study other languages, other art forms, you can do all of those things, and each one of those disciplines has its own distinctive sort of quality, its own educational sphere, its own debate, its own discourse. And cinema, is one of those that used to always have that. And it seems in recent years that we've sort of shied away from that side of the business, and it's become purely transactional and purely profit motivated. And that's a shame. And I think, Netflix might be the very thing that we need right now to embrace wholeheartedly and get some of these more intellectual films back into the zeitgeist, and stop worrying so much about what the profit motive is. If it doesn't resonate, let's make another one. We don't need to make it for $200 million. Let's make them for 20 or $30 million, something that these studios can afford, rolling out of bed. Let's make
A24 is also, I feel, another company that's trying to do that.
Yeah, right. In other words, they don't all have to be a tent pole, right? And we've only got 15. My friend was talking about something like 15 annual starts in Los Angeles these days. Obviously, Atlanta's doing more than that now, interestingly enough. And 15 cinema starts in LA and Hollywood used to be something that would happen in January, and by the beginning of the second quarter, there'd be another 15 ready to go, and there'd be upwards of 50 or more films starting in Hollywood annually at different stages in the year. And now it's dwindled considerably. So you guys are the new vanguard. You are the ones who we need to go out there and and have, have a deliberate career. Don't dink and dunk around the YouTube universe hoping to sell pocket cameras to a never-ending crowd of cinemaphiles who don't do much more than daydream beyond their living room. Get out there and make some films.
The saddest thing, in my opinion, is that I think that most industries these days, just beyond the film industry, is that they just look back on the people who built it and just want to spit in their face.
Well, biting the hand that feeds you is a real bad idea, and certainly, not showing. Well, okay, so you can't pressure people to be grateful, right? They're either grateful or they're not. So, but I think a lot of that sort of misguided criticism is coming from a group of people who are not necessarily inclined to embrace the craft and produce anything anyway. They've just gotten into the habit of learning how to get on Facebook and blather about their personal opinions without really having any basis or education to back up their point of view, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Average
okay to like
Redditor.
something. Sure, it's okay to like something or dislike something. But always, if you can, maybe there's a lesson in there, a teachable moment. Um, it's easy to toss ice water all over someone's effort, and someone's statement or someone's offering of creative art form from one form or another. I mean, myself, I'm guilty of it when I sort of poo-poo all over superhero movies just because it's not my genre of choice, right? But even so, you have to acknowledge that these things are out there. They do on some level have merit, and see if you can find the useful value in those things and learn from them in some way, and if you can apply it to your own. And then it's all about you getting out there and producing your body of work, whatever that work is, and learn from it, perfect it over time, enjoy it, offer it up for criticism or discussion, and then just let it be out there, and feel good about what you've created, offering something in the spirit of creativity. Where can the harm be in that? um, How do I segue that into a conversation about depth of field? I have no idea. So I'm just going to have to try a cold start.
Go right
um,
ahead.
but I appreciate you guys. I appreciate your input on that, and keep thinking about it because it is important. You guys are important to the next generation of filmmakers.
I had one more question.
Sure.
I was looking at some cinema cameras and I came across the RE Amira, and it had a built-in ND filter. What do you feel about built-in ND filters? Because it let you switch from 0.6 to 1.2 to 2.1.
Built-in NDs are great, man. If
Oh,
you've
you like
got
them?
them, they're terrific. The thing of it is, I mean, when I was your age, we were working with Panaflexes, and they don't have built-in ND systems. And we were using old school, man. We were going all the way
The
back.
gels.
We were going to behind the lens Ratten filters, or we were doing the cut glass in single density. And that was life, right? You needed the ND filters and the matte box, and and there was 4 or 5 people working around that camera, and we were all making it hum. Now there seems to be a lot of people that are out making films, and they're running around by themselves, and that makes it hard. And so in that respect, or if you're a documentary cameraman, in that respect, the built-in NDs can be real handy because you just dial them in. I mean, a couple of my cameras that I've had in the past have had them, and it makes it a little bit of a difference sometimes. One of the things that always concerns me, and I think it's really it's a conversation that really is a pig in a poke. In other words, there's no real substance to it, but people say, oh, when I'm running and gunning, it's really handy. I'd much prefer to have a camera with built-in NDs because it saves me so much time on set. You're working so fast. And I think to myself, I don't know what universe you're coming from, but I never had to work so fast that I couldn't take 30 seconds to grab a filter out of my AKS bag. I just never worked in that world, never in 30 years. Okay. Even when I was shooting documentaries and I was moving pretty quickly, if you're working so fast you can't stop to adjust a filter or throw a filter in a matte box, something's wrong. Something's not right.
Yeah.
So I don't buy into that whole culture of, film moves so fast you have no time to do anything. I really don't buy that at all. That narrative is convenient for folks that are selling you post-production tools like digital filters, or they're selling you on a non-linear editing system of some kind that'll offer you that kind of control later, or they're making a sort of a straw man argument leading towards, you have to shoot with a camera that has raw, zero compression video files or something. Look, the right tool for the right job. And then if you don't have access to it, what are you going to do? Not make your movie? Or you're just going to buck up and realize the limitations of the gear you've got and work within those constraints. That's really all there is. There's nothing more to it than that. If you've got them, they're great. If you don't have them, what are you going to do? Everybody right now is on the market ready to dump their pocket 6K cameras from Blackmagic, the Generation 1, because the one that came out last week has built-in whiz-bang neutral density filters. And everybody's going to throw away their old 6K camera, which has exactly the same recording codec and exactly the same color science and processor capabilities, and they're gonna get rid of that camera at a loss probably, and they're gonna turn around and spend $600 more plus whatever they lost on trading their old body in for a tiltable screen and a built-in ND filter. And I think if that is how you're operating your business, then it's no wonder that you're not going to make bigger films and have better opportunities, because you're penny wise and dollar foolish, right? This filter right here, which screws on the front, which I'm going to talk to you again about today, this variable ND filter right here, if I'd had this when I was your age, woo child, what we could have done. This thing is an amazing an effective tool that's going to eliminate a lot of your on the fly calculations and a lot of your fumbling with cut glass filters. Screw it on, dial it in, and go. And I'll show you a clip that I took out at the Cape this weekend. I went out to Cape Canaveral, and I went to the Astronaut Memorial, and I just took some quick shots around the statuary there. And I used the little I've got this nanoglass KNF concept neutral density, variable neutral density filter. And it was such a pleasure to work with that I don't know why I didn't. I've had the thing for years in my filter box, and I just never pull it out because it's not a habit. I pull out the old ones and I go layer by layer with the cut glass, and I shot with this thing this weekend just out of curiosity, and wow, I was like, you know what? I don't know why I haven't been doing this sooner. I really need to just put this thing on there and go. And whether it's built into the camera or screwed onto the front of the lens, I don't care. It's ND, it's available, it does the trick, and I can work with it. So if I can save myself $700 plus whatever the depreciation was on an older 6K camera, I'll probably run out and buy one of those in a couple of weeks and get it for, a really, really good price and laugh my way to the bank, because the image files that it's going to produce are every bit as good as the Pro body that just came out 2 weeks ago. So that's my long answer on built-in ND filters.
Yeah, they were actually the cameras for the NFL films department, people who make the Super Bowl movies, all that. And so they actually only use like one loader. They have one runner for the cables, one sound guy.
More than that. They got more than that. I actually know one of the data runners for NFL films. He lives in Orlando and works the Southeast during football season. They have at a game at any given time, they have as many as 30 to 50 cameras on a game. And
but manning the camera, they said.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, there's one camera operator and maybe an assistant for a handful of cameras that can run between them.
Yeah.
And then for every so many cameras, there's going to be a digital asset manager. Yeah. But the thing about the Amira, it's not the built-in ND filters that really distinguishes that camera. That Amira is cut from the same cloth that the Alexa is created from. So the idea was at a time when the Alexa was running, a production body was running you upwards of $45,000 to $50,000 or more, depending on which body you chose. The Amira was coming in at a slim 20 or 25 grand. And so if you were a documentary filmmaker who wanted most of the advantages or the critical advantages of the ARRI ecosystem, the color science and the chip technology and the robust durability of the camera, the quality of the build, things of that nature, the Amira was going to offer you all of those things in a form factor that felt very much like the studio camera, the Alexa, but at a reduced price. And so that was the attraction. And whether you may or may not know this, but NFL Films about 8 years ago looked really, really hard at the Blackmagic cameras, and they actually bought several of them and field tested them and almost made that their standard acquisition camera. And then the Amira came out, and they realized that they could get a lot more camera for not much more money, and they went with the Amiras for a lot of their camera people that don't own their own gear.
Yeah,
Uh,
I actually liked when they used to just use normal analog film for theirs. It made it more cinematic.
Well, time marches on, and it's the convenience. When you're talking about something with so much economics at stake, like an NFL football game, they have the confidence of knowing exactly what they've got before they even leave the stadium.
Yeah, and when you got like a corporation like NFL, you have really no say in artistic value.
Well, NFL Films, fortunately, was founded on the cinematic aesthetic, and so the mission statement of that company was never the broadcast expectation. It was always the cinematic expectation. Um, but you know, I don't know. I mean, time marches on. At some point, you've got to embrace the new paradigm because it does functionally make our lives a lot easier on a lot of levels. I mean, the sharing aspects of data, the immediacy of confirmation of your results, the flexibility of the digital format, and the fact that gear costs are coming down significantly, and the fact that photochemical is still a very volatile process from beginning to end. At any point, there are things about the photochemical process that can stymie the filmmaker. Your film can be damaged in manufacturing, and you get a bad batch, the emulsion. So, and you commit to it and you shoot with it only to find out there's a mold problem in the emulsion or a manufacturing scratch that runs the length of all your 1,000 footers in every case you bought of film. The film can be flashed or pre-exposed when being loaded. It can be flashed and destroyed when it's unloaded from the camera. It can be mishandled in processing. It can be scratched after processing. It can be stored improperly and be destroyed that way. I mean, there's so many points in the pipeline of photochemical film process where your asset that represents a huge investment on the part of your company is vulnerable. And so, yes, the digital has similar problems, but I think if you have a few very good preemptive steps in your workflow early in the process, particularly cloning and creating safety backup files, once you do that, anything in the pipeline is no longer permanently at risk of being destroyed because you have your backups that you can go back and work from, um, and save your content from being destroyed. So, I mean, digital offers far more advantages, I think, than photochemical did in that respect. And so it does make sense to move on to digital acquisition if the quality is there, if the quality is good enough. Cinema, the cinematic approach to making a film has really nothing to do with the media that you're recording on as much as it has to do with how you approach the problem of telling a story and what kind of footprint you use when you do it. Okay. So that really is a conversation that can be had outside of the specifics of the device you use to capture the images. Okay. If everything else stays the same, all you do is change out the camera from a film camera to a digital camera. If you look at the industry as a whole, at a certain level, nothing else has changed, because what the film industry was smart enough to do, and we figured this out in 2009 and 2011 out in LA when they had the industry-wide digital sort of awakening, and all the studios got together and they had that massive round of digital camera testing against film cameras. When the industry realized that the quality of the image itself, notwithstanding any of the other factors, if you could just compare an image shot with a digital camera against an image shot with a film camera and compare the quality of color saturation, signal to noise response versus grain, accuracy of exposure, and then format compatibility. Once they realized they had apples and apples, then the industry embraced digital fully and moved forward, because what they did in the process was not only guarantee that the digital media was equally as effective as film in terms of translating information in the form of images, but they guaranteed that workflows and personnel and structure of the industry economically wasn't going to suffer a cataclysmic event simply by changing from a digital camera to a film camera. So the crew size didn't shrink appreciably. The workflow didn't change for the most part, and the economics remained intact. And I think that those were the things that they were most concerned with preserving at some point when they embraced digital from regular film. In other words, what LEDs, for instance, are doing to lighting is not quite the same at all. When I was asked by Hollywood Rentals out in Los Angeles, as a rental facility, their affiliate company Olson, which is an event lighting company, came up with an LED volume light called a space light that we use on stages all the time to provide base light, or a low level of fill that we hang from above, and we let that sort of light cascade down in a very low fill level interval. We use incandescent 6K space lights, they're called, to do that lighting process. Well, on a movie like Angels and Demons, for instance, since you brought it up, it would not be unusual for us to hang 150 or 200 space lights over a set, like the Sanctuary de Popolo, where the priest hung and was burned while hanging in the shackles over the altar. There was about 150 of these 6K space lights hanging over that set, because that set was really, really big. And you don't just walk in there with, a 1K and a bounce board and expect that level of fill to reach into a room that's 75 or 100 feet long by 75 feet wide. It's just not going to work. It's not going to happen. So, we had a huge volume of equipment hanging in the ceiling over that set just for fill level, not even for key light or edge light, just for fill, just to bring the level up in the room to a suitable interval that was pretty close to what we could expose for inside in the set. Okay. Without a key light or an edge light for any shape of any kind. And just to rig those lights took a crew of 6 or 8 guys about 2 weeks. And the amount of cable and power that was required, and the amount of testing and the labor of hanging the lights, positioning them, and then dialing them in with a dimmer board so they have the right intensity, and gelling them for the right color, and all of that, that creates a whole economy of scale. People that go to work, people that rent the equipment, people that sell the gels, the studio itself, the time required to light that set, and the rental of the stages and facility charges that the studio is responsible for. I mean, there's a whole economy based around lighting movies with incandescent fixtures. So they showed me what they called an equivalent space light with LEDs at the equipment show at Paramount, the Cine Gear Expo, and they showed me this light in something like 2010 or 2011. And they asked me to test it. So I did. So I went out to Sun Valley and I tested the fixtures one day. And they asked me for my honest opinion. And I told them that light was going to be a significant disruptor to the industry. And I told them, first of all, it's not as bright as you claim it to be. The incandescent counterpart is much brighter and therefore much more efficient at lighting sets. It uses more power than the LED light, but it's 4 times brighter. Okay, so you need 4 times as many of the new LED lights to do the same job as we did with 150 incandescent lights. Now I need 600 of these LED lights to get the same volume of intensity in the soundstage. So whatever I saved in power draw from the wall, I've spent now in renting additional fixtures. But the cabling and the dimmer systems and all the other things that the incandescent requires were no longer required, which was going to put 20 to 30% of the workforce out of a job. And in a town where almost everybody works in the film industry, if you're going to put 30% of those people out of work by embracing a new lighting paradigm, you're not going to be real popular in terms of the local economics. And so, once that sort of cat was out of the bag, people started thinking really seriously about whether, what role LED lighting was going to play in the industry until we could get to the point where the lighting had the same output and the same quality as the traditional or conventional fixtures. Just like we vetted the cameras, we've had to vet the LED equivalent in our lighting packages and make sure that if we're going to switch to that kind of technology, who's going to affect those changes on set? The gaffers and the lighting and grip crews that are used to working with the other conventional fixtures. How are they going to adapt to the LED technology? And how many of those poor folks are we going to put out of a job by embracing, a new technology that's convenient for some and devastating for others? So the conversation was kind of dangerous ground for a long time, but we're slowly seeing the digital universe extend to the lighting as well. And at least on the lower end of the scale, we're seeing a slow embracing of the new sort of low cost, high output and high quality LED products. And the companies like Arri are starting to embrace that technology as well. And they're coming out with a whole system of products that are now replacing their conventional fixtures, but in a way that it doesn't upset the industry economically and only offers us more advantages in terms of expression. The new, for instance, Arri LED sky panels are way more efficient than the old style of soft light fixtures in that they are all different colors all at the same time. You can have 256 party colors plus incandescent or daylight balance color accuracy, along with color adjustments for cameras that are really finely sensitive and tuned like the Alexas. So lighting like that now is out there and available for the professionals to use. And it has made our job better, but it hasn't put anybody out of a job in the process. So it's been an interesting ride, and it's not over, man. We're still in it. The transition is still happening. We're in the later stages of it, but this whole process only started about 8 years ago. And that's about right. It takes about 10 years for an industry to turn and march in a different direction when there's so many people involved. So back to depth of field. All right, let me share my screen. You're shaking your head no. Do you disagree with any of that, or?
No, I was like, that was a lot. I mean,
Oh yeah, a lot to unpack.
no, yeah, I don't know if I could agree or disagree.
It's just the kind of thing where look, if this is going to be your career moving forward, embrace a conversation like that and do your best to understand all the factors involved, because it directly
During
affects you.
school,
It directly affects you, right? It directly
I
affects
could learn.
what kind of a job am I going to get when I get out there? What kind of job
Exactly.
am I going to go
Exactly.
out?
That's why I was talking about like that's why I was looking at NFL films because I don't know if my dreams of being a big director in Hollywood or wherever is going to pan out, and so I'm looking for jobs like that.
Some of the best directors have their humblest beginnings in places like NFL film,
Yeah,
right? Roger Deakins, he's now
he
won
did documentaries. Yeah.
a couple of really big industry awards back to back now, finally, after years of being sort of winked at and never given a statue. Yeah, I mean, he was doing small documentaries for the BBC, one man band kind of running around with a Bolex kind of thing for the longest time. And then he sort of transitioned and years and years later, here he is doing these other things. So, never discount your ability to grow and evolve and be attracted by other challenges within, the discipline. Um, so where you start isn't necessarily as important as where you end up. All right, let me share my screen here. Good conversation, though. Really good conversation. I don't get these with many of my other classes. I enjoy that you folks are thinking about these things, because I think it's important, and I think it's a great thing that it is crossing your mind so early. Okay, here we go. So I want to continue this conversation about depth of field. We've already started it a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, and I stop short each time because I don't want to bite off too much at any particular one time. But today I want to have sort of a fully evolved conversation about what this is. So hopefully it'll dispel any of the remaining um, confusion or misunderstandings about what depth of field is, and you can embrace it fully as a functional part of your approach to cinematography. What is it? Okay, so part of your downloadable PDFs this week is an article, my most recent article that I wrote for Video Maker magazine, called Everything You Wanted to Know About Depth of Field. Okay. It came out a couple of months ago. I have a copy of the article in your downloadable PDFs, and it is the basis for this keynote presentation. So the question was posed to me by the editors of Video Maker magazine: what is depth of field? Please explain. Okay, so the answer is a little bit complicated. Okay, first let's talk about the factors that are affecting depth of field. The first thing that we should understand is, first of all, depth of field is not a thing; it's a concept. Okay, and it is a concept that is part of um, the approach to cinematic photography. It can have to do with our lighting, but it predominantly has to do with factors that we're dealing with that are part of our camera discipline and our lenses, our sensors, or our film stock. And then it has to do with the apertures that we use in calculating exposure. And then it has to do with the proximity of our subjects from the camera or from the background. Okay, so if we talk about the factors that are directly affecting depth of field, there are three or four. Depth of field is determined by the lens focal length that we're using. It is also in direct relationship to the apertures that we use when we calculate our exposures. The distance from the subject to the camera, and then conversely, the distance of the subject from the subject's background, have a lot to do with how much depth of field we will experience. Depth of field then is a zone of apparent focus around our principal point of focus that we call the focal plane, the focus plane, I'm sorry, the focus plane. Okay. Anytime that I frame up anything, let's just say it's a subject standing in a volume of space. If it's a person, I frame them up how I want them, whether it's close up, medium, full body, whatever. And then I focus that image. And when I focus that image, I have the camera assistant run a tape out from the camera to the subject at the eye, or sometimes the bridge or bulb of the nose, depending on how wide the shot is. If it's a really wide shot, they can just run the tape out to the nose. But if it's a closer shot, like my little sort of thumbnail here on the screen, if it's a 2-button close-up, I'll have them run the tape right to the eye, and that becomes the focus plane, the eye. Okay, because in a close-up, the most important thing that you're going to be looking at, especially if it's a face, is the subject's eyes, right? You're going to read things in the eyes, performance, communication, intangible, nonverbal communication is happening here at the eye, right? So the eye needs to be the point of premium absolute sharpness, right? And then from that point, a volume of space around that subject will be an apparent focus based on the aperture size we're using and the focal length lens that we selected. As the focal length, distance, or F number increases, the depth of field will also increase. However, increasing the size of the aperture to a lower F number reduces depth of field. So always remember that a high f-stop number means a smaller aperture. A high number means more depth of field. A low number means less depth of field, but the physical sizes are reversed, right? The low F numbers have really big aperture diameters, right? And the really large f-stop numbers have really small aperture diameters in comparison, right? So just always keep that in mind. Sensor size can affect depth of field, but only in the aspect of like for like. So for instance, a 50 millimeter lens, here's a Rokinon 50 millimeter lens, okay? On a Canon 5D, this lens has a certain field of view, right? I'm gonna show you how this works in a few minutes with this really nifty app I got for you. But this lens, a 50 millimeter lens, has a certain field of view on a Canon 5D. The sensor in a Canon 5D is what we call a full frame sensor. It's 24 by 36 millimeters, okay? That's a pretty big capture device. Okay, and 50 millimeters is going to look a certain way. This is what we call a standard lens for a full frame camera. It approximates the field of view of the human eye without any extra peripheral vision, right? Just what you see in front of you. 50 millimeters is about the same angle of view, okay? Maybe, what is that? Maybe 80 to 90 degrees field of view, okay? If you take the same, and it projects a certain size image circle, right? If you were to take that same 50 millimeter lens and put it on what is this, a Panasonic GH4 or GH5, right? The sensor on the GH4 and GH5 is micro four thirds. It's only about 19 millimeters by about, I think, 17.3, I think is the other, or 14.3. Okay, that's a pretty small chip in comparison to the full-size sensor. Well, if this lens is designed to cover the full-size sensor, and then you put it over a sensor that's half as big, logically, what does that tell you about the relationship of this lens to the smaller sensor? The image circle, you're going to waste about half of the overall projection coming out of this lens by putting it in front of a capture device that's half the size that it's normally prepared to serve, right? So the 50 millimeter lens on the GH5 is actually going to look more like a 100 millimeter lens because you're only using the very center of the projection from the 50 millimeter on the camera with the smaller chip. You're only using part of the whole total image circle projected by the lens. And that has the apparent effect of being telephoto in nature or magnified, okay? So first we have to compare standards with standards, right? And then we can tell you how the lenses will affect depth of field. So on a Canon 5D with a full frame sensor, the 50mm lens with a certain point of view has a certain amount of inherent depth of field that inhabits the space around your subject and the subject's focus plane. If you put a 35mm lens with a field of view that is quite a bit wider at that point on the same Canon 5D, the wide angle lens is going to appear to have more zone of focus around that subject than the 50mm did. And more things will appear to be in apparent focus along with the eyes on your subject on a 35mm lens. Okay. I've got a neat app to show you how to exploit all of these variables and play with them and see how they change as the variables change, the effects, that is. So I'll show you that here in a moment. So suffice it to say that sensor size, when you're comparing apples to apples, right, Canon 5D amongst a variety of lenses for that 5D camera, depth of field changes with focal length. Okay, it gets increases with wide angle, decreases with telephoto. Okay, those effects may not be the same when you change cameras with different sensor sizes. But at the heart of all of this is the aperture itself inside the lenses. The smaller the hole, it's kind of like squinting your eyes. When you squint your eyes to see a street sign really far away when you're driving, okay, it's kind of the same thing. All that a small aperture is doing is controlling the amount of diffracted light rays that are coming through the lens, and only the premium straight rays with the most detail and highest resolution are passing through that lens and striking the image plane. Okay, all the other stuff to the edges that are bouncing around the inside of the lens barrel or bouncing off of the different lens elements and creating diffusion inside the lens, and which are then compromising the apparent focus of the image, those rays are reduced by the smaller aperture opening. That's what's happening in there. But the interesting thing about playing with depth of field, if you know how your apertures can affect it, is you can start creating situations visually that are very interesting. You can create focal point. Okay, where do you want your audience to look within the cinematic frame? What information do you want them to pay attention to? And by using depth of focus or depth of field in your compositions, you can sort of suggestively direct the audience's eye from one detail to the other within the frame, either by throwing focus purposely and changing what becomes in focus and out of focus, or using narrow or deep depth of focus, depth of field, to reveal details to the audience in the timing that you want them to understand the information. I showed you this Aperture video last week. I won't play it again because it's the same video you saw before, but I did repost it in web courses for you so you can look at it again if you need to. Okay. I want you to remember this illustration that I showed you folks a week or so ago. When we talk about the aperture, try to remember that the aperture of the lens, also referred to as the f-stop by virtue of the formula that it's derived from. One f-stop is part usually of a group of standard f-stops that are on pretty much every lens that we use. If the lens is part of the autofocus, auto exposure generation of equipment, namely the recent generations of Nikon cameras, the recent generations of Canon cameras, then something like a Sigma, this is a Sigma 30mm 1.4 lens, it's not going to have a lot of the manual control mechanisms on the external part of the lens, because everything is designed to work electronically and internally. Information and aperture sizes and control are all handled by electronic contacts, motors inside the lens barrel, and then servos inside the camera that can affect the appropriate changes to the internals of your lens. But when we're going to work cinematically, that means that we're probably going to use f-stops in a creative compositional way, and we're going to want to be able to monitor, maintain, and adjust those factors very quickly, and we're going to do it within the structure of a crew That's comprised of a first assistant who is operating the lens independently of an operator looking through the lens and a cinematographer directing the activities of that lens and that subject in front of the lens. So therefore, manual operated equipment is the best way to go. And so a cinema lens is going to have all the information we need on the outside of the barrel. Here's the witness mark right here. And from there, we can see the effects of change on the focus wheel. Here, we can see the rate of change and we can control it. We can also see the f-stops, what we have available to work with. And you're going to see a very predictable range of numbers here. Okay. And those are going to become fairly standard. You're going to see them all the time. You're going to come across them while you're working. And this is one standard set of f-stops right here in this illustration. They go from F2 to F16. Okay. I want you to remember the relationship that one iris diaphragm or a diameter has one from the next. Okay. Do we remember what this relationship was from our discussion on exposure last week? Anybody?
Each jump in the f-stop number is doubling or halving the amount of light that reaches the sensor or film.
Yeah, it's a measured amount of change. And if you jump one direction, it represents a reduction of 1/2 each time you jump. Half the amount of light from F28 as from F2. If you jump one more time to F4, F4 is half as much light as 28. Okay. And it keeps getting cut in half each time you jump. Every time you jump, that represents 1 unit of change, and that's generally referred to as an f-stop. And if you're jumping from a larger to a smaller f-stop, it is in the direction of darker or underexposure. And if you're jumping from a smaller to a larger, it's in the direction of brighter or overexposure. Okay. And one jump equals one f-stop rate of change. Okay. So that's the important thing to remember about these irises and your exposure control. Okay. But with each choice in aperture, we get a distinct difference in depth of field. Okay. If you go out in bright sun and you want to shoot, you're going to close down your aperture to something much smaller than you would use, for instance, indoors if you were shooting a photograph in your living room, let's say. This is how we prevent overexposure. If the image looks too bright on our LCD screen or on our external monitor, we close down the iris until we get the appropriate balance of color and contrast and brightness. Okay. It's a balancing act that we're playing with this aperture against the other two values in the exposure triangle. You remember what those were? We got aperture at one apex of the exposure triangle, and then we've got
ISO and shutter.
ISO and shutter, okay, or sensitivity and time, okay. The groups of F numbers can have a different look to them, though. That's what this graphic is all about. So this is a fairly standard and predictable set of numbers, F2, 284, 568, 11, and 16. You could also have an alternate set of numbers on your lens, I suppose. If you're using, for instance, the Midicon, what do they call it? Basically the low light monster, they call it on YouTube, or if you're using the Voigtlander Noctons or the Leica Noctilux, right, where the f-stops start at 1, not 2. Really big iris openings that these lenses are capable of taking big gulps of whatever light is available and passing it through that glass. Okay, sometimes the f scale will start at 1.0 and then it'll jump, and usually when it jumps, it'll jump 1, 1, 4, 2, 2, 8, 4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, 22, like so. And you can see how every other f-stop happens to look like twice what it was previously, right? And you can see a 1 to a 2 to a 4 to an 8 to a 16, right? 1 is, or 2 is twice 1, 4 is twice 2, 8 is twice 4, 16 is twice 8. Okay. On the other hand, the 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 6, 11, and 22 scale, every other jump is double the original jump. So 1, 4 to 2 is an f-stop, but 1, 4 to 2, 8, 2, 8 is double 1, 4. right? So the numbers will either be in one recognizable pattern or the other, but they all still basically mean the same thing. And each time you jump in size linearly, don't skip anything, but linearly from one size to the next, you're reducing the amount of light by half. Okay. Or the opposite. If you're opening up your exposure, you're allowing twice as much light in as you did before. Okay. So we start to understand that we can use this selective zone of focus as a compositional tool. It's going to extend, the rule of thumb is depth of field extends 1/3 in front and 2/3 behind your subject. So if you can think about the subject at the center of a circle, but then offset that circle to one focus, like you would if the circle was slightly ovular in shape, right? 1/3 of that volume of apparent sharpness will happen in the foreground of your subject, and the remaining 2/3 will happen in behind your subject, extending towards the background. In optics, depth of field is the distance around the plane of focus where the objects appear acceptably sharp. Although an optical imaging system can focus precisely on only one plane at a time, the decrease in sharpness is gradual on either side of the point of actual true focus, so that within the depth of field, the unsharpness is imperceptible under normal viewing conditions. In other words, viewing on a screen, viewing on a monitor. It may be desirable to have the entire system, the entire image sharp, and a large depth of field is appropriate in those circumstances, like landscape photography outside. In other cases, a small depth of field may be more effective, emphasizing the subject while de-emphasizing the difference between the foreground and the background, either in detail or clarity, okay? In a close-up, in a real dramatic movie, the close-up, this framing in here is generally associated with critical delivery of dialogue. Okay, there's a reason why you come in real close to a subject like this in a film, because they have something really important to say, and you want their face as they speak the words to be your primary point of attention for your audience. And in a situation like that, if there's any detail happening in the foreground in front of the subject, in other words, between the subject and the camera, we don't want any of that to have any apparent sharp detail that can distract our audience. And likewise, things in the background behind our subject probably ought to be out of focus as well, to prevent the audience's eyes from straying onto details that don't really matter in context to the line or the delivery of dialogue that your actor is about to give. So in those cases, we can use depth of field to control where our audience is paying attention. And that can be a really cool effect. And it becomes a creative choice that we now make deliberately outside of the basic essential job that this aperture performs, which is merely to balance the exposure. I showed you this graphic a couple of weeks ago, and it shows you by illustrating the words depth of field at a very wide f-stop. You can see how quickly the foreground falls off in sharpness, and likewise in the background, how quickly the image falls off in resolution towards the background as well. And you'll get more in sharp clarity as your f-stop closes down, but your image will get darker, and therefore the other two factors of your exposure triangle will have to be adjusted to accommodate that rate of change, right? Circle of confusion. This is a really tricky concept, so I'm not going to get too deep into it. Suffice it to say that circle of confusion, I think, had more relevance in a conversation when we were talking about film stock and film grains. That is the silver oxide grains that populate the emulsion of a film negative. The inconsistency of film grains, which are created organically, by the way, and then applied to the emulsion of the film stock, very irregular in shape and in size. And so a company like Kodak could get reasonably close in its assortment of grains that it applied to an emulsion, with enough consistency to be able to determine the quality of the image that that film stock was going to be able to generate. But within that variety of grains, the inconsistency in sizes and everything, there was going to be an inconsistency in apparent focus at the point of the film plane when the image was created inside the camera in the first place. Okay, and so there was a tolerance or apparent circle of confusion between the absolute surface of the film emulsion that the focus light struck and created the image, and then mere thousandths of an inch deviation between absolute focus and apparent absolute focus. And so that deviation was something like 0.002, I guess I have down here in my text. Okay, as much as little as 0.004 and as much as 0.001. Okay, in terms of manufacturing tolerances. So we needed to know about circle of confusion because it related directly to the resolution of lenses. But in the digital generation, the photo sites on our sensors are much more predictable. They're uniform in size and then predictable in resolution based on size and arrangement on the sensor. So that we don't have the same kind of inconsistencies in manufacturing tolerances that we had in the organic construction of film stocks. So it's a little easier for us to think about precise exposure in terms of digital images at the microscopic level than we could when we were making film stock. But one of the direct relationships to the image that the circle of confusion can have is in the principle of autofocus point sources of light in the background of your images. Okay. And the quality that they can take on based on the aperture that you shoot the image with and how much of a point source it is at that aperture. And they use in this demonstration, they're using Christmas lights in the foreground and Christmas lights in the background. So they're focusing on this candle wick strand of Christmas lights. And then there's multicolored, probably LED Christmas lights in the background. I say that because they're apparently cooler in color than the foreground, which appears to be incandescent in color balance. And so these point sources in the background are going to be soft and delicate, out of focus little round blobs, or they're going to start taking on a polyagonal quality based on the shape of your aperture. Let me show you on my 85 millimeter lens here. If you can take a look at the shape of the aperture, the iris inside the 85 millimeter lens, wide open, this the lens, the pathway is totally round, right? Because none of the blades of the aperture are being introduced into that iris opening. But as we close down the f-stop, you'll start to see the blades start creating flat spots in that opening, right? And so you're going to get, in this case, this lens has 8 blades in the aperture. So what we get is what they call the stop sign effect. The smaller that aperture is, the more your autofocus point sources in the background are going to look like little stop signs. So if you focus this lens on something very close in the foreground, like 3 feet away, like this strand of Christmas lights, but there's another strand of Christmas lights that are maybe 30 feet away in the background, the ones that are in the background are going to fall well outside of the zone of focus provided by the lens and the lens aperture, even at a small opening. Okay, because the subject to camera distance being only 3 feet is 10 times shorter than the distance from the foreground strand of lights to the lights in the background at 30 or 35 feet away. So those lights are going to be out of focus almost no matter what, especially on an 85 millimeter lens. But they will take on as point sources, as they are in varying degrees of out of focusness, they will take on the shape quality of the aperture we're shooting at. So if we shoot at a fully wide open aperture, the bokeh will look like we have in the frame to the far left. a nice, pleasing, round, soft around the edges, little blob of happy little holiday light. And then on the right-hand side, we get the little stop signs, okay? Maybe the f-stop that you need to use is unavoidable. It has to be a 5.6, right? For whatever reason, if you're shooting anamorphic lenses and you want to make sure that your image is in critical focus, even at 5 or 6 feet away, you're going to want to be at a 4 or a 5.6, not a 2 or a 2.8. And therefore, by necessity, you have to choose the smaller f-stop. And so your highlights in the background are going to be like little stop signs. That's unavoidable. Just understand that, if you are going to shoot with lenses that are going to demand sweet f-stops like 4 or 5.6, and that's generally anamorphic lenses, you're not going to have as much control over the shape of your bokeh in the background, which is what we call that, as you will with a spherical lens that shoots for a non-stretched out presentation image. Okay, so spherical lenses cover 1.85 to 1, like the theatrical aspect ratio, or they cover 1.78 to 1, like your 16:9 4K TV in your living room. And then the anamorphic lenses are covering the CinemaScope 239, 240 stretched out long rectangles that we see in the movie theaters. Okay, when we go to a widescreen presentation, we treat those lenses a little bit differently in the way that they render.
Don't anamorphic lenses have like oval shaped bokehs because they're kind of have this aperture, or not they don't have aperture.
And yeah, they can. It's because the image, okay, if you think about the final exhibition frame, it's a really wide rectangle, right? So what has to happen is the image has to be
squeeze it.
pressed
Yeah.
in order to fit within the confines of the aspect ratio of your sensor, right? Your sensor is not 239 to 1. Okay, it's
16:9.
something like, something like that, in that realm somewhere, or 4.3, which is even squarer than 16:9, right? So this rectangle has to be squeezed onto the constraints of the capture device, and you squeeze it, horizontally. So the optic that creates that squeeze on the front of the taking lens, they call it, will generally have an odd shape that's not spherical. In other words, the surface of the surface of my 85mm lens, you see how it's spherical, meaning that it's a portion. If you were to take that surface curved the way it is and extend it all the way around, you'd have a perfect circle of X size, right? But if you look at the surface of an anamorphic lens, and I don't have one here to show you right now, that surface is more like a mountain, right? It's higher in the center and it falls off very, very rapidly to the edges. It's not a subtle grade like a spherical lens. And so that translates into a squeezing horizontally of that image this way, right? And that's going to have effects on the apparent shape of your bokeh in the background. Okay. Sometimes it comes out as a nice football shape. Sometimes it comes out in what we call a cat's eye. If it's a really small f-stop, it'll be a narrow slit like that, like the eye of Sauron, right? And not a nice round blob like you're going to get out of a spherical Cook lens, for instance. So your bokeh will take on different shapes depending on the format of your lens and whether it's widescreen or standard projection. Okay. Other factors affecting depth of field. Focal length. Okay, so we kind of touched on that already. Aperture size, obviously, we're talking about that. Distance from the subject to the camera or the subject to the background is the other factor we want to talk about briefly. I grabbed a couple of images out of the Panaflex user's manual from the old Samuelson text. And it's trying to show you here, like on a 20mm lens, if our subject is a certain distance from the camera, we can predict a certain amount of depth of field based on the focal length and the distance of the subject to the camera. And the depth of field will extend a certain distance beyond. If you want to know what those distances are and you're using the old school Samuelson method, what you can do is go to your American Cinematographer's Manual And I always keep a bookmark in the section for the depth of field charts. And you can see where you can look up your lens focal length. You can look up at the format of film that you're shooting, whether it's 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, or 65 millimeter. And then you look up the focal length, and then you look up the distance your subject is from the camera and the f-stop you're shooting at, and it will tell you how much focus you have in and around this subject. So if we called this distance from the subject to this camera right here, let's assume that he's around 6 feet tall. It looks like he's maybe 7.5, 8 feet from the focal plane. Let's call it 7.5 feet. We're on a 20 millimeter lens, okay? And we're shooting, that's a Panaflex Gold with a 1,000-foot mag on top. So that's 35 millimeter film stock. So let's go to 20 millimeter lens in our charts here. Focal length 75, 50, 35, 18.5, or 25. Yeah, that's funny. I guess we had 19s and 21s back then. So, well, okay. Let's use 18.5 millimeters. It's close enough. Okay. And our subject is 8 feet, 7.5, 8 feet away. Okay. And if we're shooting at what f-stop you want to shoot this at? Pick one.
F4.
F4. Perfect.
Is it bright or is it dark?
Doesn't matter. This is hypothetical. I just wanted to give you an idea of how
F4.
We'll do a couple. All right. So F4, 8 feet away. You have from 3.4 feet to infinity in focus. I don't know if you can see that or not on camera. Okay. So if he's standing at 8 feet away on that wide angle lens at F4, he could be as close as here, less than half the distance, and still appear to be in focus. And he can be as far away as the background and still appear to be in focus, even though this is the optimal point of focus right here at 8 feet. But let's see how that changes if we change the f-stop to a 2 with the same lens at the same distance. Now, the depth of field is only, it's still quite a lot, but 4 foot 8 inches. So instead of being as close as 3.5 feet, it's now nearly 5 feet. So about here. And then he can be out as far as 28 feet, and then he'll start looking like he's out of focus again. The background is a lot further away than 28 feet if we're outside, right? But now, because we've opened up to an F2, he can't go beyond, say, about 28 feet, or he'll look like he's soft and out of focus again. And it's not so important that he can move to 28 feet, but at F4, the background was sharp, and now the background at F2 is not sharp if it's further than 28 feet away from camera. All right. And that can change in the next illustration. 75 millimeters, okay, at the same 8 feet, at the same F4. Let me go to 75 millimeters now. 75 millimeters, you can see right here, right? 8 feet, F4. The depth of field extends from 7 feet 4 inches to 8 feet 9 inches. What? He's standing at 8 feet. So the size of the depth of field, the volume of space around him that's in apparent focus, has shrunk significantly to where if he comes any closer than 7.5 feet, he's going to be out of focus. And if he gets any further from us than 8 feet 9 inches, so if he wavers 9 inches from where he's currently standing, he's going to fall out of focus the other direction. What a huge difference, right? And if he comes closer to the camera, so this is an 8-foot distance right here. If he comes closer to the camera, let's see what'll happen if he comes to, instead of 8 feet away, let's have him move up to about 4 feet away, which is basically right here, half the distance, right? At 4 feet away at f4 on that 75 millimeter lens, we have 3 foot 10 inches to 4 foot 2 inches. What? That's only 4 inches of depth of field from the precise plane of focus, 2 inches in front and 2 inches behind, if I'm reading this correctly. And that's crazy. Yeah, it's only 4 inches. So he can't move at all on a 75 mil lens if he's come as close as 4 feet from the camera. Okay. As a young focus puller, I used to come up against this problem all the time, because when I was a second AC, if they broke out a second camera for coverage of a conversation, let's say, in order to speed up our productivity for the day so we can get twice as much coverage in the same amount of time, they'd pull out the B camera. The second AC becomes the B camera focus puller in that situation. And whenever they brought so the A camera was always the one we would shoot on all day long. And if we needed a second camera, we'd bring out the B camera. And then the DP would hop on the A camera and operate the A camera. The operator would jump over to the B camera and operate the B camera. The A camera focus puller would stay with his rig. And the second AC, me, I would bump up to focus puller for the B camera. And then the loader would come on set and operate the clapper board. Right? I used to call B camera B for bone, because usually the B camera got the 75 or the 135 millimeter lens for the choker kind of close-ups, and the A camera would stay outside on the 50 mil. Maybe they'd go to the 75 if I was on the 135, but they always had a better shot at more depth of field because their lenses were wider, right? And when you throw that long telephoto on there, I went from having, 2 feet of focus around my subject on the 50, or 3 feet, to 4 inches on the telephoto lens. And so if I wasn't spot on in my focus control, those shots weren't usable. They were out of focus. We call them buzzed, right? Out of focus, right? So I used to call B camera bone job camera, because it was a lot harder assignment to focus on the long B camera lenses than it was on the wide A camera lenses. Okay. And that always has to do with distance from the camera. So a conversation between two people, let's say it's after this, before sunrise, right? Ethan Hawke, Julie Delpy at a table in a cafe in France. They're only about 2.5, 3 feet away. So if you're shooting competing overs, we call it, one lens on Ethan, one lens on Julie from each of their shoulder blades, right? Over the shoulder onto Ethan, over her shoulder, or over his shoulder onto Julie, right? 2 camera coverage at 3 feet away. The depth of field is nothing. And you can look at these charts in your cinematographer's guide if you want, or you can play with this really nifty app I'm about to show you. How's that for a segue?
Oh, yeah.
You know this? It's called the Depth of Field Simulator. Okay. It's created by a guy named Mike. I forget his last name now. I shouldn't, because I asked him for permission and he graciously granted me permission to use this as a demonstration tool for you guys. But he created the simulator, and you can play with it and manipulate the variables and look at an apparent difference or effect in this little sort of viewing screen. I'll show you how it works if I go directly to the website here. So we're going to go to dofsimulator.net. Okay. And I'm going to have to crunch this all the way over like I did before. And this guy all the way in this direction. There we go. Okay. So now let's show you how this works. Okay. Depth of field simulator. So what do we get? We have all these control boxes over here. This is where we plug in all of our information. And then this preview screen right here is going to show us allegedly the effects of our choices, right? So the first thing it's going to ask us is, do you want basic or advanced operation? So I'm going to select basic operation. Then it's going to ask if we want to use metric or imperial measuring distances in units. Imperial is basically, US standard measurements. So I have imperial entered in here. I set this all up yesterday, so it's still the same. I got man number 1 in terms of my model. So the next box down is asking us, what kind of model we want, what kind of background we want. So we have choices here. We got 2 different guys, adult guys. We have 2 different adult women. And then we have a couple of variations of young girl and young boy and little girl and little boy, right? So you can pick whatever subject you want to illustrate your effect. I wish that it seems like all the adults are basically one skin tone, and I wish that there was like an adult person of color, but there's not. I guess the younger woman is getting closer. As far as depth of field, though, I suppose it's not really an issue. It will be an issue when I show you the lighting simulator in a couple of weeks. The reflectivity of the skin has a lot to do with how we do our lighting. But in terms of the depth of field rendering and the lenses and stuff, I don't think it matters so much. So pick whoever you're most comfortable with working with. And then you want to pick the background as well. So I got her in front of, it's called building right now, but we've got cathedral. We've got, let me widen this out so you can see what these backgrounds really look like. We got cathedral, church, city, mountains, Paris, whoops, tree, building, and park. So there's park right there. A lot of times I use park, but you can't always see the changes in background focus with park. So I went with building the other day, and that seemed to work pretty well. Okay, so here's our girl, here's our subject. We're going to be in front of whatever this is. I don't know what it is, the library, or I don't know, state capitol building or something. It's going to ask us orientation, portrait or landscape. So obviously this is a photographic proportion, right? And this is a cinematic proportion. So we're going to stay in the horizontal rectangle. The next thing it wants to know is what camera are we using and what sensor size. So I have the Canon 5D dialed in right now, I think. What did I pick here? Yeah, I have the EOS 5D Mark IV. And obviously that has a full frame sensor, full frame, 24 by 36, that is. And then it's going to show us, based on that information, it's going to show us what our depth of field is going to look like as we change our lens focal length, our f-stop, and our distance of our subject from our camera. Okay. And you can operate these sliders. And then when it comes to distance, you can use the slider up here, or you can use this interesting illustration at the bottom of the page with this kind of ruler representing distance in feet. Okay. So let's scroll up here. Let's go to that 50 millimeter lens we were talking about before. Let's take our subject at an f4. And our subject was in our other example. How far away was our subject? Oh no, let's go 20 millimeter. Can we go to 20? No, we can only go to 24. Well, 24 is okay. 24 at an f4 at, it was 8 feet, right? So here's what that's essentially looking like, 8 feet away on a 24 millimeter lens on that Canon EOS 5D, right? Look at the background. It looks like it's got the same rate of sharpness as our point of focus, which should be the eyes of the young girl, right? That's where I run my tape out, to her eyes. So everything looks, if the world looks in focus. How can we expedite a soft background on this girl? Well, we've got 2 factors locked in. Our focal length is 24 millimeters and our f-stop is f4. And we got all this in focus. So what can we do? What are the 3 factors that we can mess with?
ISO, shutter speed.
That's for exposure.
Oh,
Talking just about depth of field now.
Change the aperture
Sure. Yeah.
or the distance to the subject.
Let's change the aperture. Let's say we got a really expensive 24 millimeter Canon L series 1.4, and let's go wide open on the 24-1.4 and see if the depth of field is going to change. A little. I mean, you can see a little bit up here on the columns and a little bit in the, I don't know what you call this up here. You can see it's a little out. If I go back and forth from 1.4 to a 4, yeah, you can see it get soft. Not much though. So that really wasn't much of a thing. If this is your frame, that's going to be your problem, right? If you want to shoot this wide, that's going to be your problem. But in my world, is this a cinematic frame? Not really. I mean, I'm only going to use this frame to do what? What's a wide shot or an establishing shot good for?
Set up the
Like
location.
the same location.
Yeah, where is she? What's she doing? Right?
Opening shot.
Once we know she's at the, what is it? Let's call this the library. Once we know she's outside the library and she's about to walk in and get a book, I don't need to see all this anymore, do I? So the easiest thing I think is if exposure dictated a 4, then using a 1.4 outside is probably not going to happen. I'm probably already using neutral density filters just to get to a 4 on a day like this. Bright, direct sun, no clouds in the sky. So let's get off the 24 mil then, and let's go into that 50 mil we were talking about before. And oh, wow. Now we're getting somewhere. Now the background, there's less of the background, right? Because the 50 millimeter has a narrower angle of view. So we got rid of a lot of this distracting architecture and got into a frame that's more conducive to paying attention to the girl. She's more important anyway. She's the protagonist, right? The library is not the protagonist. The library is the library. We want to know what's going on with her. Now, this frame is kind of cutting her mid calf, and that's, okay, it's a long shot. But if we change the distance, we're at 8 feet away. We can change the distance. Let me go down here and move her, say 5 feet. Let's get a little closer. And our angle of view is getting narrower. And now we have her in a nice medium frame. And now we can get a little bit more information out of her performance. We can still see the library enough to know that it's the library. But I think this is a nicer frame than, the 24 mil, even at 5 feet away. Although at 5 feet away, the building is a little less competitive. But at 8 feet, that building's huge. And she's only a small part of what's actually in the frame. I'm going to get my subjects to have a prevailing presence in the frame. So that's not bad. This is okay. And this, I think, is better, So let's go to 50 exactly. There we go. So that's not bad. If we go back to that 1.4 we were looking at earlier to see what happens to the background. Oh yeah, now we're talking about something. Now we're getting that nice focus separation, right? So the audience knows that we need to be paying attention to her. The background is not as important. It's just a place. She's got the plan. She's telling the story. It's her point of view, not the library. So we don't need all that detail back there to compete with the audience's attention, right? So this is more of a cinematic frame. In fact, I'll do you one better. I like a 75 or an 85. Let's go in there. Here's 85. And then what I might do, that's a standard close-up, might hang out there, or I could still back out to that 8 foot that we were at a few minutes ago and get that loose single. It's a little bit tighter than a medium, right? It's right around the belt buckle, maybe a little bit higher. And if I'm handheld, I got the luxury of dancing in this close if I want to. This is a loose single right here, and that's a very nice frame, I think. And look how nice and gently out of focus that library got. We went to a 1.4. So things that I could do, I mean, to remedy this situation, shoot later in the afternoon. Don't shoot at around midday, because at midday, the sun is as bright as it can possibly be, and you're going to be loaded with all your NDs. The nice thing about these variable ND filters now is they go well beyond the selection we had with NDs 3, 6, and 9, or 2x, 4x, and 8x. They go beyond 3 stops reduction. You can go to almost a complete fade to black with these variable ND filters. So on a 24 millimeter with this kind of filter, as opposed to cut glass, I could very well get to a 1.4 outside with a lot of light going on. I did it this weekend. I'll show you the clips in a minute. Okay, so I like this right here. This is the depth of field represented by an f1.4 aperture opening. Okay. Even on that 24 millimeter lens, when we got really close to our subject, we can get that building to start falling out of focus fairly nicely. We just can't get quite what we could get on that longer telephoto lens. So this starts becoming a question of taste. What kind of zone of focus do you like? How much of your background do you like to be out of focus, and by what measure, right? A lot of out of focusness or a little bit? Do you like your backgrounds delicately out of focus or grossly out of focus, right? And do you like wider, looser framing, or do you like tighter, snugger frame lines around your subject? I think it depends on the tone of the film, right? If it's a comedy, you want to leave a little bit of room for physical performance. So you don't want to get too close on a tight lens, because your subjects might be dipping in and out of frame and you're frantically trying to follow them with a camera that's moving far too kinetically for comedy. So you might want to relax your field of view to something a little bit wider to allow for some random or spontaneous physical performance without having to do too much recomposing of the frame to catch up, right? In that sense, you might want to be on these wider lenses. And as long as you understand that the closer you get, the more opportunity you have for soft backgrounds. You see how close the subject and camera are? All right, you can still get those deep backgrounds to be out of focus and still look cinematic. And not look like, a video camera where everything is sharp from the foreground to background, almost no matter what you do. Okay, so the cinematic quality, I think, is focus separation. So this is how you can play with this application. I like it. I like it a lot. 135 millimeter lens, woo boy. And we'll get about 8 feet away again on a 135. And ooh, there's a nice 2-button close-up right there. And wow, look how narrow that field of view got, and how much out of focus quality we can get out of a 135. I love a 135. I love a 135 and a bright 135. So, it hurt when I bought, I used to have the Canon L series 135 f2, and that was a nice lens. Then I got the 135 T 1.8 from Rokinon, and that hurt me right in the wallet. But I'll tell you what, man, at the wider f-stops, that 135, and you don't even have to be as wide as wide open as a 1.4. You could be at a 2 or a 2.8. Look, 2.8, 4, 5.6. You can be as deep as a 5.6 and still get a really nice looking background on a 135. That's focal length now doing this work for you. And if you're not shooting a close-up like this, you can stay on the 135 and you can just get further away, right? If you wanted that loose single we were doing before, back her up to 15 feet, let's say. Oh, look at that, 12 feet maybe. There's a loose single on a 135. The difference between the loose single on a 135 and the loose single on a 50, watch this. Here's your 50 millimeter lens. Here's your 5.6. Hey, let's go to a 4. Let's be fair. A loose single was back in here at about 5 feet. Uh-oh, there's that library. It's back. Because the field of view of the 50 is wider than the field of view of the 135. So you can back the camera up to keep the subject the same size in the frame, but the angle of view, the physics of the angle of view of the lenses is then going to tell you how much background you see. So let's say you're at a location and you already got the permit, you already planned for everybody to be there. It's been locked in for weeks. And then at the last minute, the library says, you know what, we really don't want to be in your movie, so don't photograph our building. What? We're going to be right out front. How are we going to avoid the building? Well, the answer is go to your longer lenses and show less of the building. So it's really hard to figure out what building we're talking about when we stand her in front of it. What building is that? I don't know. Especially if we scoot her a little bit to the left or the right and we put her in front of those white blobs that look like columns on a wider lens. And we don't know what building she's standing in front of because we're using a lens with a narrower field of view. We can keep her the same size in the frame and just change focal lengths, and the background will become disguised. Okay, this is what we call field compression. And the compression is greatest at long focal lengths, and it is least represented by wide angle lenses. So there's almost no field compression on a wide angle. That's why the backgrounds look like they're so far away. But on a strong telephoto lens, like a 135 or stronger, that background comes way up towards the foreground, narrower angle of view, and the depth of field almost never carries to the background on a telephoto lens. So it's almost always nice and softly out of focus. And I love soft autofocus backgrounds on a loose single like this. To me, this is a cinematic image. So this is depth of field simulator. This is how you can play with it. I think it's a lot of fun. It's free. It's a .net URL, so don't forget dofsimulator.net. I put the link in your materials. And check it out and play. What's nice is you can play with this anywhere, anytime, right? So it's great if you're on a bus ride or an airplane, or you're in a place where inside and it's raining all day and you don't want to take cameras outside and get all drenched and cold, right? You can sit, in the comfort of your own living room, curled up under a blanket and play with lenses and depth of field and f-stops and everything. And you can be learning all the time if you want to. So I really like this for that reason. I think it's a great tool. Okay, so moving on. So I talked to you now sort of already about the neutral density, variable neutral density filter. Remember that what they do, right? It introduces layers of neutral density or gray value shading to your image and makes your image darker in increments of full stops, right? That's for the cut glass variety, like I have here. If I look at my ND.3 filter, it is a one-stop reduction in exposure. If you look at, from my key light, one-stop reduction in exposure. The variable ND, though, has as many as 9 stops reduction in exposure, the more you dial in or dial out of the filter. Okay, it starts with 1, the equivalent of about 1 neutral density, and then it goes to almost completely dark. Wonderful, wonderful toys, and they're not that expensive. So I went to the coast of Florida this weekend. I went to the Astronaut Memorial, and they've got this little statuary, and it's all the Apollo missions on these little kiosks, and the astronauts put their hands in the concrete and then they sign it, and they tell you what ride they took, and then all of the names are engraved on the kiosk of all the people involved with that mission. And then there's an etched image of the astronaut, like a photo quality image etched into the marble. It's really an interesting exhibit. And then we got John F. Kennedy at a lectern here, cast in bronze, and his famous speech is engraved on the front of the lectern. And then we have some panels here, images from the Apollo missions. We got the Apollo insignia here, and then we've got a representation of the Earth and the moon sort of cradled within the design of the Apollo logo. And it's outside in this little park. And so I picked this angle. I had a nice blue sky behind with just some delicate wispy clouds. The sun was over here setting at about 4:35 o'clock. So it was a low angle. You can see the angle of the sun right here from Kennedy. Actually, this is a shadow from this light right here, this camera. So that's the sun angle right there. It's fairly low angle, you can see. And so I shot it on the widest setting on the variable ND. I chose a shooting stop of 4, I believe. I rolled my shutter angled to 180 degrees, 24 frames per second, even though I wasn't recording any dialogue. I kept all the variables where you would normally have them if you were shooting some film, a scene out here, and an f-stop that I would probably use outside, a 4 or a 5.6, let's say. And it was way too bright, right? This is way too bright. We got value in here that on the waveform monitor was what we call clipping. It's well above 110 IRE. So it's the data in these highlights is gone. It doesn't exist. So you could darken this image all day long in post and you would get weird muddled values in here, but it would never look right. It would be totally, solarized. So you need to control that part of the exposure. You need to darken the overall image so that these values don't clip. You got to bring them down to something like 95 IRE, 98 IRE, maybe, if you're feeling gutsy, just so that there's some detail in the image file that can be retrieved and played with in post as far as exposure correction. If you blow out the value to where there's no real detail in there anymore, the compression has just eliminated it, then you can never darken this value. It'll never get dark. So you pull out that variable ND and you rotate it open and close and see what you get. So I rotated it to a proper exposure and then I held it there for a minute or two and then I rolled it as far close as I could get it to show you what it does, and then I'll roll it back again. You can almost, depending on the sun angle, you can almost get a fade to black out of this filter, almost. So that's the variable ND. So it's much stronger than cut glass single filters. This one is a 1 to 9 stop, I think. It doesn't really say on here. I think it's set on the box, but that's the KNF Concept Nanoglass variable ND. Okay. And it's nice because now I can decide what f-stop I want to shoot at for the depth of field quality, and then rotate this filter for exposure control. It becomes a real simple way to control exposure. Were you going to say something, Alan?
No, that was me.
Go ahead.
Basically, you turn that thing and it just gets darker.
Yeah.
It's cool.
You bet it's cool. And I've had the funny thing is I've had this filter in my filter box for years. And I just, a force of habit, I never grab. It's never my first impulse to grab this filter. It is now after last weekend. I'm like, why haven't I been doing this sooner? This is so much easier. Because I don't, I've dealt with exposure for so long in my life that it just, I'm like, yeah, if I'm at this f-stop, I need to be at this shutter speed, this shutter angle, that, blah, blah, blah. It just kind of rolls out. I can't stop it.
Is this available on UCF campus?
Pardon?
Is that available at UCF's campus for their film projects?
I don't know if they have these yet or not, but I can tell you that there's a conversation coming this week between me and Mr. Bow, and I'm going to ask him if he can buy you guys a whole bunch of these.
Oh, heck yes.
I went out and I bought a 62 millimeter size. I bought one of these little FZ1000, so I would have the same camera you guys have access to right now as Cinematography 1 students. And I took this rig and a monopod. That's it, with the fader ND out to the coast. And I shot all kinds of stuff. And I'll tell you what, man, and not only did the camera do a terrific job, but the camera and in combination with this filter made it so easy. There was no thought involved anymore. You flip out your screen, it gives you the image right here, and you just rotate that filter until you get what looks nice. And I turn on the little histogram. I told you guys that the histogram with the little sort of waveform in it tells you what your highlights and shadows are doing. Put that little waveform right in the middle of the screen initially, so you can see what the exposure is doing to make sure the big mountains aren't clipped off at the top. And then look at the image on the screen, clear out that little histogram, look at the image on the little monitor. If you like it, shoot it, because what you see is what you get, right? You can increase the size and look, at the fine detail and make sure that it's in focus, and that places like down here that I was worried about being overexposed are no longer overexposed. And you just shoot it. And so you lock in your ISO based on on what? What did we say the best ISO to start with was?
Was it 400?
800 actually.
How do we know? How do we know if it's 400 or 800?
Check the camera settings.
The manufacturer tells us which one it works best at. Remember, it's called the native ISO.
In the native ISO, because native
Some
ISO,
cameras, the native ISO is 400. Some cameras, the native ISO is 800. All it means is the manufacturer has tweaked that imaging system to look best at one of those ISOs. And you start with that one and see what you get. I shot this at 800 ISO. The reality is I think the native ISO on this camera is 400. When I looked at these images on a 50-inch screen, I could see in underexposed areas, I could see a hint of noise in the image. So I know that this little FZ1000 is not native 800 ISO, it's native 400 ISO. Okay, so that's your base ISO for the FZ1000, 400. Start there, lock it in, right? Then what's the other thing we can lock in right away?
you can look at the aperture.
The other thing.
Shutter speed.
Shutter speed, 24 frames, dialogue, done, bang.
Gold standard.
Right? 1/48, 24 FPS is locked in for dialogue. Native ISO is locked in for sensitivity. Now I know, outside during the day, I said, you know what? I'm not gonna be able to keep these backgrounds really out of focus. So I'm gonna go for a 4. I want to see if I can get to an f4 outside with all of this light. And it was really bright out. So I locked in my aperture at a 4. My criteria was, I just wanted to be a 4. I don't care. Okay. And then I wanted to see if I could get the image to balance with the fader ND. And of course I could. Right. So all it becomes at that point is lock in everything you want. I want native ISO. I want dialogue or 24 frames. I want my favorite f-stop for the depth of field and bokeh results that I enjoy. All of that's locked in. So now it becomes a filter game. And I'm just going to turn that filter back and forth until it gets to the right brightness or darkness. Done. No math, nothing. Just turn the filter till you like it. Point and shoot, right? I don't think it can get any easier than that. And I was really encouraged by that result, because I know that especially in the beginning, when you're trying to learn all this stuff and balance all this information and so forth, that it's hard. It is. And it, practice makes perfect, but you'd be out shooting, I mean, you're in your film career, your days are going to be 12 to 14 hours long, 5 days a week, and you don't have that kind of time to practice right now. So, we take advantage of the technology, select some tools that give us the most flexibility, and then go out and play, because it's really about having fun. If you can't enjoy this, what's the point? Right. And this makes it very enjoyable. So all of a sudden, I'm not lugging around a stack of cut glass filters anymore. I would have liked to have gone with my, my GH5 and my cinema zoom and the matte box and everything, because I like the form factor and everything. And I really like this zoom that I've got over here. The 20-70 DZO is a wonderful piece of glass. But, those weren't the constraints that I was concerned with. I wanted to go out with the same camera you guys have, with the same kind of, an objective and just a variable ND, and see if I could get really good results. And I got to tell you, this little camera, this lens that's in this camera is razor sharp. So I got some stuff and I put it on a really big screen in my living room, and I looked at I shot some close-ups of the Kennedy statue, and I got some interesting angles, all around the statuary and stuff. And I'll tell you what, the lens is razor sharp. The exposures look very nice. The colors and the gamma coming out of the camera are very nice. And the ND filter, I was worried because you know, you can spend as much as you want on a filter like this. I mean, there are B&W filters out there, and this is a 77. So the larger they get, the more expensive they get. And then by brand, they can be exponentially more expensive. A B&W filter in 82 millimeters is like $300 for a variable ND. And I think in 77 mil, I paid about 150 for this one. And for 62, I only paid I think it was $65. So it wasn't bad, right? For the little K&F concept. And I thought K&F concept is definitely not B&W. B&W is a high quality shot glass German filter. And it is an expensive filter, but it's got an impeccable image clarity to it. And I thought, well, the cheaper filter, there's got to be a trade-off somewhere. But there really wasn't. It was fine. It was totally fine. So I was pleased at that fact as well. So I'm going to see if we can get a handful of those in there for you guys to check out when you go to shoot, because I think it's the way forward for a lot of you. That's basically it. I just want to refresh your memory of the effects of the exposure triangle that we were talking about. Shutter speed affects motion blur and balances exposure. ISO affects camera sensitivity and manifests in grain or noise in the image. And then the aperture balances exposure, but also dictates our depth of field. Okay, so there's always going to be a trade-off and then an aesthetic for every variable that we want to play with. Okay, exposure balance is our ultimate objective, and then our aesthetics, whichever aesthetic we prefer, we bias our choices in exposure to favor that aesthetic as well. Okay. And I won't bother you with a discussion about the light meters tonight. We'll cover that more when we do our lighting discussion. I've touched on it a little bit here last week, I think. And this, since it's really depth of field, we can leave the light meter for another week or so and touch on it again later. There's a little glossary of terms here that you should be familiar with by this time. This same glossary is the glossary of terms I put in my article. So that's down in the downloadable PDF. But by now you should be able to define the aperture, the angle of view of a lens, understand the difference between background, middle ground, and foreground. Composition is the arrangement of elements in the frame that we're talking about. Depth of field is the area of acceptable focus around our critical point of focus. Understand that diaphragm, iris, and aperture are all talking about the same thing. Exposure is the condition in our images of brightness or darkness and degrees of either way. The exposure triangle is the concept that we refer to when we are talking about controlling exposure. Focus, it's kind of cut and dry. Focal distance, the distance of your subject from your camera. Focal length is different from focal distance. Focal length talks about the field of view and apparent magnification of your lens, right? The image field, all areas within the frame, right? From foreground to background comprise the image field. And then the field of view is the angle of expression of each lens that you choose. How wide can you see? How much of that image field is visible through that lens? The plane of focus is the point of critical focus, and it's usually what?
Eye.
The eye or the tip of the nose, depending on how far away they are, right? And then to resolve an image is to achieve a point of, or a state of in-focusness, right? To resolve the image. And that's it. So you got a little homework assignment. Read the Video Maker article, What is Depth of Field? And then check out chapter 6 out of the Introduction to Cinematography text. Chapter 6 is about shots, shot selection, scenes versus time. And it just talks about depth of field and lenses and what lenses to choose for what kinds of shots. It's an interesting chapter. I think you'll find it an interesting read. Okay, and that's your reading assignment. You're also going to have a shooting assignment. I want you to think about depth of field from a compositional point of view And I would like you to craft some images on video that use depth of field in creative ways. So you're going to give me a total of 4 video clips, it looks like. I want you to give me a wide shot, like an establishing shot with a deep depth of field. Then show me a second shot that shows a character in that environment and control the point of focus. And then create a third shot where you are using bokeh, those autofocus highlights, as a compositional element. That's probably going to be a shot that you're going to do at night, because in order to see point sources in the background of a shot, the light levels are going to be very low. So you're either going to be inside without very many lights on, or you're going to be outside in the dark, or like, you know, downtown at night or something, and use street lights as your point sources, street lights in the background. That's the easiest thing to do. And then I want you to do another another shot where you're going to control a focus pull, but this time I want it to be intentional. A lot of you in your assignments did focus pulls that don't really tell a story. They just pull focus from the foreground to the background. And that's fine if you want to just play with your sense of timing and nailing the points of focus from foreground to background. That's fine. But I want you to show me a focus pull now where it tells some kind of a story, like, you know, somebody who recognizes somebody in a crowd and you shift the focus from the viewer to the point of view and shift the focus, or something along those lines that tells a little bit of a story. Okay. And put all 4 of those shots into a very simple sequence. Use Premiere, Final Cut, whatever you want to do, iMovie, I don't care. And just toss it up on YouTube for me. And so you're going to send me a document with a YouTube link on it. Okay. And that's your homework assignment. Hopefully pretty simple. It's just a little small 10-pointer. I just want to, I want you to show me, demonstrate for me that you can achieve these results. Okay. Doesn't have to be fancy. I don't need a lot of complicated drama or a script. I don't need, you know, just whatever you got to do, but try to use people. Avoid using stuffed animals and inanimate objects. Try to get people involved in your projects. This will be a good opportunity for you to practice your interpersonal begging. Ask people to be involved and help you to be your camera subjects. Okay. Break the ice a little bit with your colleagues or something. So that's it. Okay.
I have a question about this.
Yes, please.
This, you said this has to be done with our phones, correct?
I did not say that. You can go to UCF and you can rent one of these from the film lockup. Okay.
Okay, and this will be due when?
What did I put on here? Let's go to web courses and check it out. So it's due March 22nd. That sounds like a week from now.
Okay.
Is that anxiety that I sense in your voice?
No, it just might clear my throat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty simple. I would think that you can do this in the course of a week. The reason why I say you're probably not going to want to use your cell phone is because your cell phone, okay, it's one of those situations where chip size does matter. The size of your image sensor in your cell phone is the absolute smallest there are. And therefore, it's kind of like a wide angle lens. You're going to get a lot of depth of field with a tiny image sensor. And it's going to be really, really hard to get selective focus on a cell phone. It can be done. You've got to get, there's a software app you can get for the cell phone that'll give you manual control over the phone and some sense of iris control. And if you get that, you can achieve a little bit. If you have a variety of lenses, like I think Trinity's got 3 lenses on her phone, if you can go to the telephoto version of your lens assortment, you might be able to get some nice selective focus out of your cell phone. But like mine, I've only got 1 lens, right? And I have a little bit of digital zoom on here, but digital zoom is not the same thing as focal magnification. All digital zoom is doing is taking the wide image frame and magnifying it. And so it's not the same thing at all. And so you won't get the apparent depth of field changes with a single lens in a digital zoom. It has to be a specifically designed focal length that represents telephoto as opposed to wide angle. And then you might see the differences. But again, it's a tiny, tiny chip. The chip in this guy is a little larger than a half an inch. So it's not quite, it's a little bit smaller, just a tiny bit smaller than Micro Four Thirds. Okay, so you can get selective focus with this. You can very easily because the lens is an equivalent focal length of 25 to 400 millimeters. There you go. Okay, so go to telephoto and go to its widest f-stop is a 3.5. And then play with the camera to subject distances, and you'll find that you can get some very nice soft autofocus backgrounds with this camera. There's nothing limiting you in that respect by using the FZ1000. And we got plenty of them for you guys to check out. I think we got 30 of these at school. So should be no problem. There should be plenty of gear available.
There should be more than enough because there's like 11 of us here.
Yeah, you guys, I think most of you have your own stuff anyway. So, I mean, what are we even talking about, right?
I don't.
So
11 in the whole cinematography class.
what's that?
There's not 11 people in the whole cinematography class, Andrew.
Right now, no. I mean, you guys got, like I said, 45 or 48 in your class, and those people, if they're not even motivated to come to a Zoom meeting, they're probably not going to go check a camera out from UCF. Maybe, I don't know. I could be a little hard on them, but if you guys got your own gear, you're set up anyway, you're good to go. So
But still,
I would be interested, Trinity, if you're inclined to use your cell phone, to really see the performance of those lenses, to see if they really act like regular camera lenses. Because if they do, that's an incredible breakthrough.
I'm honestly super impressed by this phone's camera. Like
Yeah.
it shocks me every time.
Well, see if you can fool me. See if it, I mean, I love being tested like that to see if I can figure out whether you used your phone or whether you used an FZ1000, most of the time I can tell, but these phones are getting better and better every season. So it's interesting. If you can get true shallow depth of field on a cell phone lens, that'll be a breakthrough, a major breakthrough. So see what you can do with it.
Okay.
Anybody else? Nothing? No questions, comments, observations, criticisms, gossip? All right. Well then, let's adjourn, right? It's just 8 o'clock. I think that's a good place to stop. If you got any problems or questions with the assignment, shoot me an email. We can also have, supplementary Zoom if you need it for something. But go forth and commit acts of film. All right, folks.
Have a good night.
To call it a night. Thanks for your time and attention. Have a good evening, and I'll talk to you, next week?
23rd.
Yes, sir. Take care.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.